I'm not sure you can call this a designer dupe because the designer inspiration is very different to my finished article. I do follow a lot of fashion vloggers and there was a bit of a craze for the Dior Book Tote and I fell in love with that thing, but it was £2,000. I do have an embroidery machine, but I don't have an embroidery machine that would do a panel that large. I've watched the making of the Dior Book Tote and it's fascinating to see how it's actually put together. There's absolutely no way that I could replicate the exact method that they've used here at home with the machines that I have. So I decided to go down a slightly different route, and rather than embroider the entirety of the fabric pieces myself, I would buy embroidered or tapestry like fabrics that I could use to create my semi-adjacent version of the Dior Book Tote. I made this one a good 4 years ago now. It's held up so well. I am genuinely amazed. The tapestry fabric has got a few pulls in it. That's really the only thing that I think is wrong with this one. It's absolutely gorgeous and I love it, and like I say, I use it daily. But you guys did ask for a sew along, so I made another one and I love how this one has turned out. There is a blog post to go along with this video which details all of the fabrics you'll need, the interfacings you'll need, if you do decide to go down the purse feet route, which hardware you'll need. It also has the dimensions of all the pattern pieces that you will need to cut out, and that is linked in the description down below. I will go through very quickly with you now all of the pattern pieces, so let's have a look at those and then we can get to the sewing. There will be a full blog post linked in the description down below, but if anybody wants to take a screenshot of all the measurements that are written out here, feel free to do so. I'll go through them really quickly with you. The bag is 16 inches wide, 14 inches high and 7 inches deep. Those measurements in centimetres: 41.5 centimetres wide, 33 centimetres high and 18 centimetres deep. I've done mine slightly differently to the original. I haven't included any of the embroidery on the sides and the bottom, which give the bag kind of more of a concertina shape, but purely and simply because of the thickness of the fabrics that I'm using to get the structure that I want. Depending on the result that you want, you may need slightly more fabrics than this, but at the very least you will need your outer fabric and you will want something that's got a decent amount of structure in it already. I went for this tapestry fabric, which is absolutely beautiful. Found it at one of the knitting and stitching shows. You're also going to want a matching lining. I am going to put another nameplate on my bag, Kittenish Behaviour, but it will actually fit on the bag and not fall off the end like this, and I'm going to carry that stripe the whole way around the bag. I personally like how that looks, but you don't have to. That is just a decorative element, and for that I'm going to use a white corduroy fabric that I do have embroidering in the background as we speak. So that's my lining fabric and my outer fabric, plus the extras if you want to have a nameplate on it. For interfacing, you'll want something like the Violin F220 or the equivalent Pellon, which is SF101. This was just what my local fabric shop had in stock. You're going to want bag making foam. This one I got from Minerva Crafts. I will list this in the description down below. And the final interfacing that you'll need is Decoville Heavy for the base and for some structural pieces in the upper. So I'm going to get everything cut out and then I'll go through all the pieces you should end up with. As I mentioned a few times, there is a blog post to go along with this video. The blog post has all of the dimensions, pattern pieces and pieces that you will need to have cut out ready for the next step. So be sure to check that out, and I've done it that way so that you don't have to pause the video or keep going into the description of the video for the measurements, the seam allowances, etc, etc. I will say now though that the seam allowance for this bag is 1/2 inch unless otherwise stated in the sew along. Okay, first up we have our side pieces. And I have interfaced the Decoville top band side pieces to the top of my side outer pieces, and I have offset them by the 1/2 inch seam allowance at both sides, and then I've gone for 5/8 of an inch seam allowance at the top, just because we're going to be turning the top over, so we're going to maintain the 1/2 inch seam allowance, but we just want a little bit of extra wiggle room for the turn of cloth. That's the 2 outer panels. Then the 2 lining panels, I have interfaced those with the interfacing, so there is no kind of offsetting of those at all. So that's the side panels. The front and back panels, I've done the same thing. The Decoville top band piece, which is here, I've offset it 1/2 inch in and then 5/8 of an inch down, just again to allow for turn of cloth. And then the interior, I have, or the lining, I have interfaced as well, so we can put this to the side. The base panel, I have fused on the Decoville bottom panel, again offsetting it into the seam allowance, so that's 1/2 inch all the way around. And then the interior one, I have interfaced that with the interfacing, so that is the bottom panel. These straps, I have interfaced these straps. I haven't been interfacing any of the tapestry until this point, and I've interfaced these straps because they will take a lot of wear and tear, and I want them to be super strong. And this is something that you need to bear in mind, because we're going to be sewing through the 4 layers of this as well as the outer bag fabric to secure these straps to the bag. So you want to make sure that your sewing machine will sew through all of those pieces. These pieces have been pressed in half, then the raw edges have been pressed in to meet that, and then it has been pressed flat, and I've done that for both of the straps. And then the final thing that I've done, and this is optional but I really like how this looks, I have fused interfacing to my decorative pieces, so these are ready to be sewn to the other decorative pieces that I have. I have cut these at 1 inch wide and the same width as the decorative pieces, and I'm going to sew them to the decorative pieces at 1/2 inch seam allowance. So when I turn this back on itself, you'll see 1/2 inch of the orange, and then that can be top stitched, and I'm going to do that for the top and the bottom of all 4 pieces, so the 2 front and back and then the side pieces. You will also want some sew-in foam cut to size. There is a piece for the bottom of the bag which is cut exactly the same size as the outer and lining fabric. Then there is a piece for each side panel in each front and back panel. Those pieces are 1/2 inch shorter than the outer fabric, so that you don't end up with too much bulky foam in the top edge when you are turning things over and finishing the bag off. Before I sew the decorative trims together, I am just going to top stitch down the edges of the handles. So I'm going to do that a 1/8 of an inch away from the from the folded edge, and I'm going to stitch those 2 together, and then I'm going to do it on this folded edge for decoration and to make it look even. And so I'm going to do that for both handles so that they are completely sewn together. Then we can move on to the trim. Straps are sewn, so I'm going to put those to the side, and as I mentioned, I'm going to be sewing the trim, the orange trim, which is just felt, which is why I don't need to worry about hemming this. I'm going to sew it to the top and the bottom of the white trim at 1/2 inch, and then press everything flat so that I'll end up with a nice band that I can then sew the whole way around the bag, or I'll sew to each panel, which will then look like it goes the whole way around the bag. So I'm going to match those up like this and sew at 1/2 inch top and bottom, and I'm going to do that for all 4 pieces. I have sewn my orange felt onto my white corduroy and pressed it so that the seam allowance is into the white corduroy, so everything's lying nice and flatly. I've then drawn a line 3.5 inches down from the top edge, and I know it's the top edge because that's where the Decoville is, and I've drawn a line with my friction pen, and I have lined up the top edge of the orange felt with that line, and I've done the same for all of the pieces. So I'm now going to top stitch the felt down at the top and the bottom to that 3.5 inch line on all 4 pieces, so that we can then start attaching the sew-in foam to give the bag a little bit more structure as well as some prettiness. I have top stitched on the decorative pieces. Now we need to attach the foam to the outer bag pieces. So I'm going to flip it over, and we are going to take our foam piece and we're going to line up the bottom edge and the 2 side edges, and you'll notice that it's actually about 1/2 inch shorter than the outer bag piece, and that is on purpose because we're going to be turning this a top bag piece back on itself to hem this, so we don't want foam in that seam allowance because it would be impossible to turn it over and get a nice crisp edge. So what we want to do is actually match up the bottom edge, the two side edges, and then we're going to sew all the way around at 1/4 of an inch because our seam allowance on this pattern is 1/2 inch. So we're mounting the foam to the bag outer within that seam allowance so we can then sew everything together later. So I am going to wonder clip all the way around the edge, and as I say, starting at this top edge here, back stitch, so at 1/4 of an inch all the way around those 3 edges, and the top will be left free. You'll be able to get your hand in there. That is intentional. We will be sewing the top down later when we top stitch the lining into the bag. We want to repeat this for the front, the back, the 2 side pieces, and then the actual base of the bag, which we attached our Decoville to earlier. There is no difference in the size of the foam for the base of the bag, so we're just going to sew that all the way around on all 4 edges and out 1/4 of an inch to mount those 2 together. If you want to put feet into your bag, now is the time to do it, and I would suggest that you put the feet in 1.5 inches squared from this corner edge in all 4 corners, and then find the middle point and put in an extra pair of feet there, so you have 6 feet in total. I haven't added feet to my other bag, and I don't have any in stock that match the hardware that I'm using. For other pieces of this set, there's no actual hardware in this bag, so I've decided not to put feet on, and I haven't missed it in my other bag, but you can put feet on, and if you do, you want to put the feet on before you put the foam on. Okay, so I've got all of the foam mounted to my outer pieces, and I have gone through and marked in the seam allowance at all of the corners, because for this bag to work we're going to be sewing up to but not past the seam allowances. The very first thing that we need to do is take one of our side panels with the right sides together. We are going to match up the raw edge and then sew from seam allowance point to seam allowance point and backstitch at the beginning and the end, leaving the seam allowance free. So we're going to do that for the 2 long panels on either side of the base. Okay, so before this gets too unwieldy, I want to put on the handles. I have gone for a measurement of 4.5 inches in from each raw edge, so it's 4 inches in from the finished edge. So we've got the folded edge here, and then we've got the sewn together edge here. And I like to have the sewn together edge on the inside of my handle. It's just a minor preference, but that's generally how I do it. Whatever you do, as long as you mirror it on the other side, it's totally fine. I have just sewn this in at 3/8 of an inch and basted it backwards and forwards a couple of times. We're going to stitch it into place again when we top stitch the top of the bag. I was slightly worried that that wasn't going to anchor the strap enough, but my other bag, I've used it for years now and it's been totally fine. So I'm just going to repeat the same thing that I did with that one with this one. On the other wide side, this one here, I'm going to measure 4.5 inches in from the raw edge. I am going to place my folded edge against that marking, top stitch it down, and then 4.5 inches in from this edge, make a marking, top stitch that down, and then we can get on to sewing the side pieces to the bottom panel. But first, put your straps in. And again, you don't have to wait till you've sewn this to the base to do this. You could have done this beforehand. It just occurred to me whilst I was sewing these panels onto the base that it's going to start getting unwieldy in a minute and I ought to have straps on there. I have sewn my bottom panels on and I have left the seam allowance free. So the next thing that we need to do is take our side panels and we are going to place those along the bottom there, and again we are matching up the seam allowance and we're sewing from seam allowance to seam allowance, but making sure not to catch any of the seam allowance from the top panel. We're going to do that for both sides. So I think you can just about see here that I have sewn up to the seam allowance but not past it, and that means that all of the seam allowances from the 3 pieces that are meeting at that corner are free. It's looking like a giant cross at the moment, like that. So the next thing that we need to do is sew up the side seams. You are going to do this very carefully because we want to try and match up our trim to make sure that that kind of flows evenly around the bag. We also want to match up the top of the bag, and we're going to sew right to the top of the bag. We don't want to leave the seam allowance free at that point, but we are going to be sewing down to the seam allowance again and leaving the bottom edge free. We don't want to sew any further than the seam allowance that we've marked. So I'm going to get that all clipped into place, trying to pay special attention to the trims so that they line up nicely, and get that sewn. I'm going to do that for all 4 sides. All of my side seams are sewn up, so we now need to trim the seam allowance in these corners so that when we turn the bag right side out, the corners will turn out nicely. You want to trim close to, but not completely up to the line of stitching, obviously, and we want to trim all 3 pieces of fabric from each of the corners of the base. So I am going to get that done, and then we can turn the bag through. So I've trimmed off all the excess from the corners, so now I'm going to turn the bag the right way out and hope that the stripes have kind of met up nicely. I don't expect them to be perfect, but I would like them to be pretty good. Yeah, they're pretty good. Okay, so I just need to take some time to work out these corners and get everything sitting nicely, because we've taken the time to sew it nicely. So yeah, just work through the corners, push them out, make sure that they're nice and square and corner-like, like that one. I'm going to do that for all of them. Then we can start working on the lining. So now we need to make the lining. I've done the same thing. I've marked in the seam allowance on this one. It is 1/2 inch. I've marked the seam allowance in on the side panels and the front and back panel. I'm going to sew the side panels on first, and again I'm going to sew from seam allowance to seam allowance, leaving the excess free, and then I can sew on the front and the back panel. Then we can sew the side seams, and then we're going to drop our lining in. Well, we're going to press it, then we're going to drop our lining in. I have sewn the lining pieces together, and I'm now going to go and iron all of those seams open. The other thing that I need to do is iron over the top edge so that we have a nice 1/2 inch pressed finished edge, so that I can top stitch the bag closed in a moment. The way that I like to do that, and I'll do it on this shorter piece, is I actually draw a line double the amount that I want to fold the edge over by. So for this one, as I mentioned, it's going to be 1/2 inch, so I'm drawing a line 1 inch down, and when I fold the raw edge over to meet that 1 inch line that I've just drawn and press it, that means I'm folding over it exactly on 1/2 inch. So I'm going to do that for all 4 of the sides and press the bottom nice and flat as well. Then I can sew up the side seams. I have pressed over the top edge of the lining. I have also pressed open the side seams, which I've obviously sewn shut as well. So the lining is completely finished. I have also, on the actual bag outer, turned under or turned over the seam allowance along the top. I've done that encasing the foam here. So the next thing I'm going to do is drop the lining in, and I'm going to tip you up a bit so you can see this. So I'm going to drop the lining inside, and one thing that I did do when I was turning this top edge over was to make sure that this seam allowance was open, and I'm going to match up the seam allowance on the bag lining to the outer. I'm going to clip it into place the whole way round, and then we can top stitch the bag together, which will finish off the bag. The reason that I'm doing it like this, rather as a drop-in lining rather than a turn through lining, is because there's a lot of foam and Decoville in here, and we've already turned it through once, and I really don't want to bend the Decoville any more than I absolutely have to. So that's why I'm doing a lining like this. So the thing is to make sure all the seam allowances are open, match the seam allowances up, pin everything in place, and then top stitch at 1/8 of an inch, and then I'll probably go around and top stitch again at 3/8 of an inch away from the top edge, just to make sure that everything is going to stay in place. So I'll get it all pinned and sewn and show you what it looks like. Okay, Okay, everything is pinned and clipped together. So now I have to top stitch everything, and I'm going to do that from the inside because again I don't want to turn this bag out or in and out too many times because it's just not going to be good for all of the Decoville pieces around here and in the base. So I'm going to line it up and top stitch the entire edge of the top of the bag together, so the lining and the outer together. I'm going to probably, as I say, do that twice, once at 1/8 of an inch away from the folded edge and then another one at 3/8 of an inch away from the folded edge. So let's get that done. It will be a little bit of a wrestling match, and it might get to the point where I backstitch and take the work from out from under the sewing machine and then reposition things and put it back under rather than trying to wrestle the bag the whole way around. It might be easier to do it that way, but we shall see as we go around. Wish me luck. This is what it looks like when it's finished. I think you can just about see there's 2 lines of top stitching around the top edge. Here it is from a distance. I absolutely love this, and I'm really glad that I added the orange in. I wasn't going to, but I think it's really made the kind of like nameplate pop. The nameplate and the decorations around here are completely optional. You don't need those, but I do think it gives a real nod to the Dior original. It just looks cool. I like it. I like it a lot. I know not everybody has an embroidery machine that will allow them to embroider either this size or just embroider in general, so that is an extra that you really don't need. Something else that you could do would just be to put another stripe around it. I really like the stripe look. I think it just adds a little extra to the bag. All in all, I am over the moon with this. Absolutely gorgeous. I am making an entire set. I have my power trip bag for all of my tech gear that's cut out and ready to go. I've made a pencil case for my everyday use pens and pencils, and you can see the tutorial for that up here. I'm going to get a little bit more of this fabric because it is still available, and I will link to it in the description down below. I'm going to get a little bit more of this, and I'm going to make myself a laptop sleeve as well, so that I have a matching set, because I really love this fabric and I really love how this bag has turned out, and I hope you decide to make your own. And if you do, please use the hashtag Shan made me do it, because I would love to see what you have made. If you've enjoyed this video, you might want to check out this one here.